So here we start with our uh, presentations, and the first presentation is by Dr. Ian Blumer, who is an eminent endocrinologist from Toronto, Canada. He's a founding consultant to the Charles H. Best Diabetes Center and a lecturer at the University of Toronto. He has been awarded with many awards, but to mention here two important awards, one from Canada and one from India. So the Canadian is the Diabetes Canada's highest clinical honor, the Gerard Wong Award. And from India, it's a Professor Mohan Award in India. He has many scientific publications on his name. And besides, he's authored many books, including a novel. So with this short introduction, I request Dr. Ian Blumer to have his words of wisdom for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen here. All right. Can you see my screen okay there?
Absolutely fine.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So it's really an honor to be invited to speak on the discovery of insulin. You know, it's so incredible to think that in 100 years on this very day that insulin was first given. And, you know, I don't know how many of you have visited Canada and Toronto. So Toronto is having an incredibly cold day today. In fact, right before we started this, I looked, and this will blow you away. In Toronto today, it is as cold as the top of Mount Everest. Isn't that mind-blowing? Anyhow, it's going to warm up later today. So I was asked to speak on the discovery of insulin, and it's truly a pleasure and an honor to do this. So by way of background, a while ago, it was January of 2009, I received my issue of Diabetes Care, which you probably all read as well. It's the world's preeminent diabetes journal. And it was a very unusual cover to that particular issue. And there was this letter written by a child. And I thought, that's very peculiar for a scientific publication. So I looked a bit more closely at it. And what I noticed was the letter said, and it was, you can see the date up there, December 21, 1922. It said, "Dear Dr. Banting, hope you arrived safe and well. The same day you left, I gathered some nerve together and gave myself the insulin, and I've been doing it ever since. I am feeling great." I thought, wow, that's interesting. And it turned out that letter was written by a young girl. Actually, it was a young girl who avoided death because of the recent discovery of insulin. And it was quite fascinating as I read more about it, that young girl's survival, that one individual changed the course of history because she became the mother and then a grandmother to one of the most famous diabetes researchers in history. And some of you may know her. I had the honor of being a friend of Lois Jovanovic. And she set basically the standard of care for managing women who are pregnant with diabetes. So I asked her more about her story. I was so fascinated by this. And what she said was that when these were her words, I actually asked her to write a little note. She said, let me just back up there. She said, "My great-grandfather," this is way back, "sent a letter to Dr. Banting in Toronto." You can see where she was. Her grandmother was in Winnipeg, up there on the left, in Toronto, which is where I am, pleading to him to help because my grandma just developed diabetes and was dying. And Dr. Banting responded that he would help if the family could keep my grandma, these are Lois's words, alive for the long trip to Toronto. There were no planes back then to take people between cities. And she says, "My grandma survived the trip and was given insulin. Thanks to Dr. Banting, grandma lived." As you all know, before the discovery of insulin, there really was no effective treatment for diabetes. And when I say diabetes, basically all diabetes back then was type 1 diabetes. The prognosis was grim, and it was basically a death sentence. You know, I have 3 children, and the idea of looking at one of my children suffering from such a horrible disease with no treatment, I can't imagine how devastating that was for parent after parent after parent. 50% of people diagnosed, and it was children really, died within 20 months. And there were all sorts of bizarre treatments used before insulin was discovered. And, you know, I'm not trying to be condescending. You know, if you're talking about a disease for which there's no other treatment, people are desperate. People will do whatever. So bleeding was done. That was common for many diseases. Blistering, use of opiates, oat diet, why oats? Milk, rice, potato diet. Some children were treated by eating as much as possible. And on the flip side, some children were treated with starvation. Can you imagine? You take a child who's wasting away from diabetes and then you starve them to treat them? How horrific. This particular doctor, well-meaning as he was, would lock children or others with type 1 newly diagnosed, lock them away so they couldn't access food. How horrible. Again, well-intentioned, but misguided ultimately. Insulin, as you know, changed everything. Here's a child, 1922, 15 pounds. And just months later, after being on insulin, look at that transition. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Mind-boggling what insulin did to help individuals, so many individuals. So here's the story. I mean, I could give this talk in 30 seconds or less. If I was to present it in the stereotypical traditional fashion that most people think about when they talk about the discovery of insulin or when they conceive of it. And this is especially, you know, not being holier than thou, this is especially what most Canadians believe when we celebrate this journey in our history of a country. So this is the stereotypical concept of what the discovery was like. In 1921, Frederick Banting, who was a brilliant physician, he awoke from sleep having had a dream about how to cure diabetes. And with this in mind, he went to the University of Toronto and borrowed some laboratory space to work on his project. And he got a student, Charles Best, that's Charles Best on the left, Fred Banting on the right, to help him. They spent a few months that fateful summer performing studies on the pancreases of dogs. They isolated a secretion which came to be known as insulin. The end. I bet 99% of people who know anything about the discovery of insulin thinks that's the story. Frederick Banting was a genius, found Charles Best, spent a few months and discovered insulin and changed the course of history. Well, that's not exactly how it really unfolded. Here's the real story. So in 1920, Frederick Banting was a newly graduated surgeon. He was actually an orthopedic surgeon, of all things. And he looks young. I think he was 29 at the time. And he was working in a little town called London, Ontario, which you can see there. And that's where he was staying. He was renting space on the upper floor of that house. And he couldn't find work as an orthopedic surgeon. He actually had no patients, no referrals, did no surgeries. So he got a job teaching physiology at the local university. And he was working on carbohydrate metabolism, preparing a lecture. And he was asleep in that very bed. And he came across a journal. And the article he came across was the relation of the islets of Langerhans to diabetes with a special reference, et cetera, et cetera. So he was reading about this article, which discussed a patient who had had pancreatic duct occlusion due to a stone, and it destroyed the exocrine part of the gland and left the islet cells intact. And he said, it was one of those nights when I was disturbed and couldn't sleep. I thought about the lecture and the article, and I thought about my miseries. Yeah, he was miserable. He had no patients. He was living alone. And finally, at 2 a.m, an idea occurred to me. And he came up with an idea about how to find a substance that could control glucose metabolism. And he got up from bed and wrote down his idea. Now, I think this is pretty cool. That's the actual paper that is still around in preservation. And he talked about diabetes. And you can tell he was a surgeon. He didn't actually know how to spell diabetes. He said, no offense to surgeons out there, they can make fun of me too. And he said, you ligate the pancreatic ducts of dogs, you keep them alive till the acini degenerate, leaving the islets, and then you try to find a secretion from these islets that could relieve glycosuria. So he thought his idea was novel and brilliant. And I guess it was. But he didn't realize that he wasn't the first to have considered this. He just wasn't very well read. And he certainly wasn't well read about the world of endocrinology. He wasn't the first to think about this at all. Years before, other researchers had thought about similar concepts. I'm only going to show a few. There's actually dozens that you can find and read about. But Dr. Sulzer in Berlin in 1906 had already looked at developing a pancreatic extract and had actually injected it into someone with ketoacidosis, and the coma resolved. And he gave it to more patients, and that also worked. But Banting didn't know about that. Canadians don't know about this. We all think Banting and Best were the pioneers. Well, they were, but no work goes on in isolation. And so Dr. Sulzer concluded it's possible through the injection of a pancreatic extract to eliminate the excretion of sugar and acetone in a diabetic. Well, fast forward a few years, Dr. Kleiner said, oh, look at this. And he injected ground pancreases intravenously into dogs with diabetes, and 100% of them showed an improvement in their glucose. And he said, this extract has a possible application to human beings. It should be looked into further. And then Nicholas Polescu in Romania, a few years later, same thing, injected pancreatic extract intravenously into diabetic dogs and also found improvement. So other people had had a similar concept, but the thing is, having a concept, having an idea, doing preliminary work is of no value ultimately to mankind if nothing further happens. And that's what happened for all those researchers, again, dozens of them. They did initial work and then, for a variety of reasons, stopped. So great ideas, but not executed. And therefore, when Banting and Best started their research, people were dying every day from untreated diabetes. So Banting was so excited about his idea that he met with Dr. Macleod, who was actually a world-famous physiologist at the time. But you have to appreciate, so Dr. Macleod is this eminent world-famous physiologist, and this 29-year-old unemployed surgeon comes in and says, hey, I've got an idea about how to cure diabetes. I want to work in your lab. Well, can you imagine how Dr. Macleod would have reacted? He would have looked at this person, Fred Banting, and said, really? Who are you? Why are you even approaching me? But amazingly enough, for goodness knows what reason, Macleod said, you know what? I've got some space in my basement in the lab. Sure, go ahead. So what happened next? This was the lab that they used. That's the actual lab in the basement of the University of Toronto Medical School building. So he needed an assistant, and he asked, there were a couple of people available. And what I want to emphasize, because I never thought about this till I started looking into this a few years ago, these were kids. Like Banting was only 29. Charles Best, who is credited as the co-discoverer, he was only 21. He wasn't even in medical school yet. He was an undergrad science student. So these two folks, they tossed a coin to see who would work first. Charles Best won the bet and ended up getting the job. So what happened then? Well, things progressed incredibly quickly. In just the span of a few weeks, they made immediate progress. So they removed atrophied pancreases from dogs. They got an extract. And amazingly enough, these 29 and 21-year-olds in the lab, in the basement, managed to come up within weeks of an extract to lower glucose levels. And they tried again, and again, the glucose levels fell. And they said, wow, what do we call this? Okay, well, we'll call it islatin. Anyhow, it came later to be called, as we all know, insulin. So what happened then? So Charles Best, in the summer of 21, wrote a letter to a friend. I think it's great to have this. He says, if what I'm working on is a success, I'll be famous. But then again, I don't think it's going to happen. And then Macleod, again, the professor Macleod, wrote to Banting and he said, if you can prove that such an extract really has the power to reduce blood sugar in diabetics, you will have achieved a great deal. And this, I think, is telling. This is where Macleod shows he knew the literature. He said, others have published similar results, but their proofs were not adequate because Macleod was approaching it as a scientist. So after that initial success, what happened then? Nothing. Things went really badly. They tried and tried to take this solution, this material, and replicate their success. Didn't happen. And then they ran out of dogs. Oh, by the way, no time for it now, but it's actually quite controversial about where they found these dogs, but that's a story for another day. So they ran out of dogs, so they actually could no longer ligate these ducks. So they said it'd be way too long. So they actually started using the whole gland of a pancreas, which basically is totally different from Banting's original 2 o'clock in the morning idea. So they weren't making progress. So what did Banting and Best do? They said, we need someone to help us. And the unsung hero of the discovery of insulin is James Collip. He was in Alberta. He was in Calgary, which is in Western Canada, but he was a really good biochemist. So Banting and Best were desperate. They were going nowhere. And in fact, if they had not brought in Collip, insulin would not have been discovered by them. So Collip came in and joined them, and he was much more capable of purifying what later became known as insulin. But at first it didn't work. And I think this is so funny. At first he failed, and it turned out the material he was given was actually thyroid tissue. It wasn't even pancreas tissue. Well, no wonder why that's not going to help treat diabetes. But after that, Collip had success after success through incredible work and cleverness. And then he tried it and he injected it into a rabbit, and a rabbit became hypoglycemic. And lo and behold, Collip was really the first one to clearly, get this purified extract and found it worked, at least in rabbits. So he wrote, he said, we have obtained from the pancreas of animals a mysterious something. Isn't that a great phrase? A mysterious something, which when injected into totally diabetic dogs completely removes the symptoms of diabetes. It's a problem to isolate. No one has ever proved this would work. And then look at that, 100 years ago today, they took this extract and gave it to a human. 100 years today. I give you folks who organize this meeting all the credit in the world for timing it to be 100 years to the day. I think that's just awesome. In fact, this morning, as I was getting ready to leave my home, my wife said to me, did you know today is the 100-year anniversary of the first ever injection? And I said, as a matter of fact, I'm going to be talking on that very subject. Where was it given? The Toronto General Hospital, which is about a kilometer or less from where I live. It was given to Leonard Thompson, a 14-year-old boy who was said to be as thin a creature as ever walked the earth. And the stuff, as purified as it was still said to look like a thick brown muck. And it was injected, and Banting was waiting outside the room, wanting to know whether it was going to work. And the result? Well, it sort of worked. They were excited to see any drop in glucose, but not nearly to the extent they were hoping. And then the person got an abscess and the researchers felt dejected and thought about giving up. Call-up was said, oh, this is useless. All my work has gone for nothing. But they were tenacious. The child was dying. There was a slight improvement, so they got back to work. And Macleod said to a reporter, as you can imagine, the press was excited. We have no hope to offer anyone yet. Someday, maybe. Then he was given a second injection, January 23rd. So a couple of weeks later. And look at that drop in glucose. That's impressive, isn't it? Going from 28.9 down to 6.7. Can you imagine how excited the researchers were when they saw that? Not only was it in a lab, but the boy, Leonard Thompson, was said to look brighter, more active, stronger. And then within weeks, like nowadays, this would never happen. Within weeks, they published their findings. And there you can see their signatures, some of them at the top in this journal. And they concluded these results leave no doubt that we have a therapy of unquestionable value in the treatment of diabetes. Just weeks or months before they were ready to give up. And now, February of 1922, they felt confident they had made a life-changing discovery. And the floodgates flew open. The press was all over it. And of course, they mistakenly called it a cure. You know what? Even the press nowadays calls insulin a cure, which really frustrates me. So worldwide attention, this is my favorite, a letter sent to the doctor who cures diabetes, Toronto, Ontario. And within months, insulin became commercially available. As you know, the Nobel Prize was given to Banting and Macleod, but they shared it with their colleagues. So in summary, these are my conclusions. Without the work of this team of researchers, sure, insulin would have eventually been discovered. It's just like the light bulb would have been discovered. And so many other discoveries, electricity would have been discovered, lots of things, but these people did it first. And even if they saved a year or 2 years before, it would have been discovered by somebody else, that year or two saved thousands of lives, including Lois Jovanovic's grandmother. And it truly was teamwork. It wasn't just Banting and Best, it was Banting, Best, Call-up, Macleod, and others who preceded them. So in my estimation, they're all heroes. And as said by a colleague at the reception honoring the Nobel recipients, the discovery of insulin provides glory enough for all. And Banting's recognized around the world. There's awards, high schools, stamps. There's a crater on the moon named after him. How awesome is that? Canada is a small place. The Toronto General Hospital, where the first insulin injection was given, that's where I did my residency. And it's also the place where I met the person who later became my wife. We actually met right in that building on the endocrinology ward. That was clearly prophetic. That's Banting, that's my daughter's friend, one of her close friends, who actually is the great-grandniece of Frederick Banting, and her name is Banting. In my waiting room, just outside the door here to my right, I was given by Charles Best's son, I met him years ago, a couple of ties. Those are ties that were worn by Charles Best. Sometimes I think patients come to see me just to see those ties, not actually for the clinical consult. The diabetes center with which I'm affiliated, that's Marlene Grass in the front who started it, it's called the Charles Best Diabetes Center. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure sharing this information with you.